start with our world lead and a sea of protests in Israel after the worst fears came true for the families of 6 hostages. Their loved ones returned in body bags this weekend. Israel's health ministry believes they were shot by their Hamas captors in Gaza at close range shortly before the Israeli military reached them. One of the 6 is 23-year-old Hirsch Goldberg Poland, a dual Israeli-American citizen whose parents have joined this show several times. Today, his mother, Rachel Goldberg, spoke at her son's funeral.
If there was something we could have done to save you and we didn't think of it, I beg your forgiveness. We tried so very hard, so deeply and desperately. I'm sorry. Now, my Hirsch, I ask for your help as we transform our hope into grief and this new unknown brand of pain.
And now, grief has transformed to anger for hundreds of thousands of Israelis. Today, a nationwide strike, and many still on the streets of Jerusalem at this late hour, calling on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to secure a hostage and ceasefire deal. Despite that, Netanyahu dug in today, attempting to justify Israel's continued war with Hamas, insisting Israel will not withdraw from a key area of southern Gaza, a major sticking point in the proposed negotiations. President Biden answered with his own pressure on Netanyahu, pitching a take-it-or-leave-it deal, which the Washington Post reports, if it's not accepted by both parties, will mark the end of the American-led talks. 3 of the 6 murdered hostages, including American Hirsch Goldberg Poland, were expected to be released in the first round of the latest deal. There are now just 4 American hostages believed to still be alive in Gaza. Let's get straight to CNN's Jeremy Diamond in Tel Aviv. Jeremy, you've been watching these protests unfold over the course of really the entire day. Give us a sense right now of the anger on the ground there.
Well, Phil, over the last 24 hours, we have witnessed nearly constant protests, not only here in Tel Aviv, but across Israel. And in those protests, yes, there has been anger, but there has also been grief, anguish, despair, so many emotions mixed in these protests. But above all, what we witnessed was a call to action as protesters demanded that this Israeli government change course and prioritize reaching a hostage deal.
Outrage in the streets of Tel Aviv. For the second night in a row, tens of thousands raising their voices, demanding Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu strike a deal to bring home the hostages alive. This outpouring of grief, anger, and frustration prompted by the deaths of 6 Israeli hostages, whose bodies were recovered over the weekend. Hamas executed them hours before Israeli troops discovered the tunnel where they were being held. But to many here, their deaths are a grisly reminder of the Israeli government's failure.
The day before they were alive, you saw their names on the deal that could have been signed. 3 names were on that deal, and they're not here.
We know that Hamas has agreed to a deal at some point, and Israel was the one putting on more and more terms and actually postponing the deal. And right now we know the decisions that our Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it impossible for Carmel and other hostages to return and put their lives in grave danger. And that's what killed them.
Netanyahu, meanwhile, doubling down on a core Israeli demand that has been a sticking point in negotiations and blaming Hamas.
The evil axis needs the Philadelphia corridor, and for that reason we must keep control of the Philadelphia corridor. This is why Hamas insisted we are not going to be there, and this is why I insist that we are going to be there.
In Israel, the pressure is building on Netanyahu. Schools closed early, flights delayed, and buses disrupted as the largest union went on strike Monday for the first time since October 7th. And in the U.S., more pressure.
Do you think it's time for Prime Minister Netanyahu to do more on this issue? Do you think he's doing enough?
No.
For the family of 23-year-old Israeli-American Hirsch Goldberg Poland, grief is now taking center stage.
I will love you and I will miss you every single day for the rest of my life. But you're right here. I know you're right here. I just have to teach myself how to feel you in a different way.
And hope that this moment will be different.
For 330 days, Mama and I sought the proverbial stone that we could turn over to save you. Maybe, just maybe, Your death is the stone, the fuel that will bring home the remaining 101 hostages.
That his son's death will not be in vain.
And Phil, that hope that we heard from Hirsch's father, that his son's death might be a catalyst for change, it doesn't seem to have anywhere to go right now. And that's because the Israeli prime minister tonight really doubling down on his position that he will not budge over this demand that Israeli troops retain control of the Philadelphia corridor, that strip of land between the Gaza-Egypt border. And Hamas is insisting that Israeli troops withdraw from there. And that leaves these two sides deadlocked. But for now, the hostage families, they are keeping up their fight, calling for more protests tomorrow. Bill.
Jeremy Diamond live for us in Tel Aviv. Thanks so much. Meanwhile, as former President Trump tries to pin blame directly on his opponents for what happened in Gaza this weekend, President Biden and Vice President Harris just arrived in Pittsburgh for a joint Labor Day rally. CNN's Kayla Tausche is there for us. Kayla, they will be in public at a campaign event shortly, but they were also together this morning behind closed doors in the Situation Room. What's the latest from White House officials?
Well, Phil, the vice president and the president are going to seek to shift into campaign mode here in Pittsburgh in front of a very full Union Hall after grappling with the devastating events over the weekend. President Biden adjusting his schedule, returning to the White House this morning to helm that meeting in the Situation Room where he and the vice president, which the White House listed out by name, were both discussing with their national security team the situation that unfolded in Rafah over the weekend, as well as the latest on the ceasefire and hostage negotiations, which have been going on for weeks after the U.S. convened an emergency summit in the region on August 15th, where it believed that that would be the beginning of the final stages toward a final deal. You heard President Biden in Jeremy's piece say that he believes that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not doing enough, underscoring these long simmering tensions between the two leaders, even as President Biden has been reluctant to publicly criticize Prime Minister Netanyahu. But when pressed about what specifically he wanted to see the Prime Minister do, this was how Biden responded.
Still negotiation, not with him, with my colleagues from Qatar and from.
Now, after a hostage and ceasefire deal has eluded the United States and its partners for the better part of a year at this point, President Biden was asked why he has any optimism left that he could get a deal this time around, and he said, Phil, simply, hope springs eternal.
I want to bring in now Congressman Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey. Congressman, thank you very much for joining us. Your constituent, Idan Alexander, is also one of the hostages who is being held in Gaza right now. His parents have written in the New York Times in an op-ed. They wrote, quote, "Our window to rescue the hostages is closing, and the Prime Minister is fastening the latch." Do you agree, Congressman, that Netanyahu is obstructing a deal?
I agree that, and I've spoken to the Alexanders, multiple times a week, and just yesterday again, and I just can't imagine the pain they're in right now. And talking to them, they have a right to be very angry because Idan Alexander, who's my constituent, they haven't heard from him, and he's not home. And I think everyone must do double down all efforts to make sure we do everything we can to get the hostages home. I know the parties are back at the negotiating table in Doha. They have to stay at that table, work 24/7. I know that's what we are doing as Americans. We're at the table. Everyone's got to be there. We've got to get this done. We've got to get hostages home. We've got to get a pause. And of course, we've got to make sure that Hamas is no longer able to do what they did in the last days, the unspeakable, what they did in brutally murdering 6 hostages after what they did on October 7th, including obviously Hirsch and whose funeral we just saw images of. And I just can't imagine the pain that all these families go through every single day.
But Congressman, you're seeing this anger, frustration, sadness boiling over, hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets. We all know that Hamas is ultimately responsible for the deaths of these 6 hostages and so many others. But to what extent do you think Netanyahu bears responsibility here for not agreeing to a deal?
Well, I think until the deal is done, that the hostage families and frankly the citizens of Israel, and I think everyone has a right to be angry until the deal's done. However, let's not lose sight of one reality that, and I just don't think we should brush this aside. Hamas is to blame. Iran and their proxies are to blame for what happened on October 7th. And listen, today they could lay down their weapons and free the hostages, and this would be over. They've chosen not to. The Israelis, as you know, time and again have agreed to the American position here and the framework. And Hamas continues to do what they're doing, including saying today that they'll do what they just did over the last days, shooting hostages, right, killing them in cold blood, as they did on October 7th and doing it again. So I think our anger, my deep-seated anger, is that the hostages who continue to attack Israel, continue the other proxies, the Houthis, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah continuing to fire rockets into Israel. You see the Houthis continue to attack the United States of America and our position. So we shouldn't ever lose sight of that. But I think everybody has a right to be really frustrated because a deal has not gotten done. And everyone's got to stay at the table until this deal gets done. And I understand the anger.
The Biden administration, U.S. officials involved in these talks, they have been reluctant to criticize Prime Minister Netanyahu during the course of the negotiations. But President Biden making it clear today that he does not think that the Israeli prime minister is doing enough to get to a ceasefire. If the U.S. wants a different outcome, to get to a pause in the fighting that will eventually become a permanent ceasefire, what pressure would you like to see from the Biden administration?
Well, I think the fact that they're speaking out is a lot of pressure. I also think the president also said that Hamas needs to be held accountable, right? I mean, I think there has to be pressure on all parties to get a deal done, right? To get this pause, to make sure that Hamas stops using innocent Palestinians in Gaza as human shields, to make sure that Egypt seals the border so that there aren't more tunnels, so that more reinforcements don't go to Hamas to kill more. Right. And I think we've got to make sure we do everything we can to keep the pressure up, but not lose sight of actually who led to this. Right. And never lose sight of the fact that terrorists here are Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis, all Iranian-backed proxies. Iran is our #1 enemy, working closely with China, Russia, North Korea, right? Continue to attack the United States of America, our democracy. And so let's not lose sight of that fact that we got to know who actually who's committing evil here. And don't forget the fact that they literally brutally murdered 6 this week, including an American, right? They've killed 46 Americans on October 7th, and since then, 7 Americans remain hostage. We have not, and they need to come home.
Well, I think,
and we should never, and I don't ever lose sight of that fact. So we got to keep pressure on all sides all the time. We as Americans, as we've been doing, need to work 24/7. The administration needs to work 24/7. And I think that's the key here.
Out front now, Jonathan Deckelhen, father of Israeli-American hostage Sagi Deckelhen. Sagi is a husband and father to 3 young daughters, including a baby girl who was born after Sagi was taken by Hamas. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. Can you tell us about your reaction to this news of these hostages found dead, as you've been waiting now months to hear anything about your own son's location or condition?
Well, my reaction, like all Israelis, was absolute horror and sympathy for the families, most of whom I've actually come to know over these nearly 11 months, and double horror because we know for sure that none of these 6 beautiful young people needed to die. Had Israel moved forward in good faith before and Hamas been pressured enough, this deal could have been signed a month and a half, 2 months ago. And in all likelihood, most, if not all, of these young people who were brutally murdered by Hamas would be alive today.
Tonight, you heard Netanyahu. He said that he asked forgiveness from the families of the hostages, but then he doubled down on why he will not agree to a Hamas demand that is holding up a hostage deal, which is securing that Philadelphia corridor along the southern side, the Egyptian-Gaza border. President Biden has told reporters he doesn't think Netanyahu is doing enough. What do you think?
Well, I think I know that all of Israel's senior military and intelligence officials have said out loud, publicly, repeatedly in recent weeks and months that there is no reason, no strategic or tactical reason including the Philadelphia corridor, for Israel to continue to delay signing this or moving forward quickly towards signing of this agreement for a ceasefire and hostage release with Hamas. So the prime minister, his justifications that we heard again tonight are based on issues that have nothing to do with our national security, but it would seem have far more to do with his own political interests and not rocking the boat within his own far-right coalition, full of messianic nationalists that care nothing for our hostages beyond, sort of lip service. And so there's no doubt there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis out in the street. I think someone made the computation that it would be tantamount to 35 million Americans protesting at one time. I mean, think about that. The Israeli street has spoken about this. It is time for our government to stop delaying and time for the international community to do everything it must to pressure Hamas to get to yes.
I think that's the hope of so many of these families. During her eulogy, the mother of American-Israeli hostage Hirsch Goldberg Polin, whose body was one of those recovered this week, and she said that she hoped his killing will be a, quote, turning point. You are in Israel where we've been watching these protests that you mentioned. Do you have hope that this is going to be enough? I mean, you put it into perspective for just how big this would be population-wise, but do you think this is actually something that gets through to Netanyahu?
It's very hard to know. Look, we can do what we can do here in Israel. It seems to be clear that the Biden administration will, in the same way that Netanyahu is doubling down on this fantastical narrative that he has about security in Philadelphia, which, by the way, he didn't even mention for the first 8 months of this war. We will need help. We'll need help in getting the Netanyahu government to yes. I want to believe that a combination of this massive pressure within Israel and Israel's friends, making it clear to the Israeli government that there are no more excuses for these essentially political delays. And Netanyahu, I don't know if he has the moral backbone to stand up to his radical right, messianic zealot coalition partners, but he must find it. Israel is lost otherwise. And this is really about the heart and soul of our own country, the lives of the hostages, and stopping the madness in Gaza.
Jonathan, you met with White House officials last night. Many of the families have been in regular touch with them. How much faith do you have in the Biden administration right now to actually influence Netanyahu?
Well, as little faith, I think that most Israelis, and certainly myself included, have in my own government. I have absolute faith in the Biden administration. That's been proven time and again since October that they understand the gravity and the urgency of the situation right here, right now. That every day that passes, more and more hostages who have survived somehow for the last 10 or 11 months in a living hell in Hamas captivity are at risk. And so I believe that the Biden administration will put maximum pressure on both Israel and Hamas through the intermediaries, of course, to get both parties to yes. But at the end of the day, there are two men that have to sign on a document. One is Yahya Sinwar, a mass murderer who's somewhere underground, one would think, in Gaza. And the other is Benjamin Netanyahu, who seems to be more interested in the preservation of his own political power than the cohesion and the best interests of our country.
Jonathan Deckelhen, thank you for being with us. We are thinking of your family and your son, and we appreciate your time tonight.